Thank you very much for your participation so far, for your energy and for the patience as well, and staying with us for the whole day. Now, we wanted to make this, I have to say, we wanted to make this really, really much more informal. Actually, the idea was going to put the chairs here, move the screen away, maybe even kind of sit literally in the middle of you and then have a kind of really, really relaxed personal conversation about anything else that you wanted to kind of ask our keynotes based on all the things that they said today. But because of the camera angles and various other things, basically we had to sit here like the plenary committee of the Communist Party of Serbia. But let's not kind of, don't allow that to spoil the fun. So we've heard a lot of absolutely amazing and thought-provoking ideas and lines of thinking and arguments, I would say as well, for various aspects of our world, our modern world, or shall we call it the new world in some ways. And we would really like to open the floor even more now and just kind of talk about things, not presenting things, just actually go deeper and kind of on a more personal level about exploring some of those issues. But you are the key ingredient of this, meaning your questions, your comments and questions particularly to the keynotes. We've got 5 books here from the FMK publishing arm, and basically please do ask questions, because at the end of the fireside chat our guests are actually going to pick the most interesting answer for each of them individually, and that person, hopefully that's not going to be the same person, is going to get one of the books for free. So there's your incentive to ask questions, and some people here probably already deserved one, but we'll see what we're going to do about that later on. I'm going to start with actually a few questions to a few people, just going to go into a little bit deeper into things. Des, one of the things that you mentioned in your keynote is how is the agency or the lack of agency or the perceived lack of agency in this new world, in the systems and media particularly. And my question was, and Andrew was referring to that as well, that there's almost like a sense of a bit of desperation, that we are now faced with all these forces and we kind of don't know what to do with it and can't do anything. So my question is, do you think that we should, I'm deliberately asking you this and provoking you because I know you're an activist, I know what your answer is going to be. Should we despair?
Why are you asking me the question if you know my answer?
I wanted you to say it out loud and actually to explain to us how. That's the more important. I wanted to ask you, should we despair? I know you're going to say no. Should we despair because of that lack of agency, and even more importantly, how to bring that agency back as citizens?
I dispute that there is a lack of agency. The point of determinism is to convince us that we have given up our agency in favor of technology, systems and machines that are more intelligent, more efficient, kinder, better looking, etc., etc. But the fact is that's a lie, and I'm surprised. As much as I hear about digital resignation, there are enormous numbers of examples of digital activism where people, as with any other walk of life, it takes too long, it's probably badly coordinated, we wish it had happened sooner, but at some point people do come together to defend what they see as either privacy or healthcare or basic democratic rights. So it is not the case, let me make it more active, it is the case, it's to the very beginning of the web. There have been movements to try and defend what people see as public spaces or as the possibilities. From the end of the 90s up to some of the big mobilizations I'm sure Mara knows more about, over net neutrality, you know, admittedly many of them have taken place online, which may have some issues around slacktivism. But I would, you know, encourage us to think about the times when people actually do come together. I always give the example, given that we are about to have 2 more days of demonstrations here, you know, Mexico has one of the most concentrated media systems, highly corrupt political system, which is reflected in the utter lack of diversity of its media. For many years, there's been small numbers of activists desperate to see something happen. It took a bunch of students alienated with what they saw as the lack of political choice, this was a few years ago, who then seized on the media as the kind of focal point of a lack of democracy and made all sorts of demands around media democracy at the same time as trying to break open what they saw as a corrupt political system. Student-led, very spontaneous. But this is the kind of thing that we should draw attention to. So for every example of digital resignation, I would hope and suggest and encourage that we think of ways in which we should, we can come together, because these are, technology is not just different. It's fundamentally different. This is about control of our lives. These are about public spaces. And for every campaign to defend a library, to defend pensions, I would put technologies in the same bracket.
Can I give an answer?
Yeah, absolutely.
As well?
Yeah.
Discussing. Yeah, I think it's really important that we don't take negative lessons away from all of this. So to give you a practical example of where very intrusive advertising technologies have been booted out of Europe by citizen pressure, the Open Rights Group, which is an NGO based in the UK, and a privacy protester called Alex Hanf, essentially what they managed to do, they managed to remove the practice of using deep packet inspection in advertising. Deep packet inspection is essentially tracking data at the pipe level. So rather than web-based behavioral advertising, which kind of tracks websites as you move between websites, deep packet inspection tracks at the kind of the most intimate level in terms of the piping itself. And yeah, activists managed to get that booted out of Europe. So the point is, when it comes to media and technologies, yeah, change is certainly possible.
So to pick up on that one, on the possible changes, and that's kind of question for everybody, Manu, that's your kind of territory as well. Des is kind of quite engaged in the political economy of media. We did mention new ways or possible new ways of financing media. So if the traditional advertising model is broken, and about 45 to 50% of the revenue of many of the Serbian newspapers come from native, and you've pointed out very, very rightly, it's kind of erosion of trust that actually brings to an already feeble kind of trust in media in this country. So what else, if advertising doesn't work anymore, that doesn't bring any money, if native is undermining trust, what else to do in order to finance media? What are the other new, innovative, enlightened solutions to actually support the media system?
I actually think Des said something. What was the thing that you were talking about, putting a 1% levy on?
Yep.
And it's really interesting because I can't believe it. It's probably close to 15 or 20 years ago when there were a large number of local newspapers in the United States that were all folding at the same time. And it was newspapers that had been around for 100, 150 years. And suddenly they didn't have enough advertising revenue. And I was trying to get an op-ed into newspapers all around the country. And all of them said, this is a really great op-ed, but we can't use it because it's too self-serving. And basically what I was saying was that grants should be used to support newspapers, because this is a fundamental part of our democracy that ensures that citizens know what is going on. But I think whether it's grants, whether it's a levy against other media technologies, and certainly we all know that Facebook and Google are the ones that are sucking the money out of the advertising system, and yet they produce nothing, right? That's the one thing to really think about. Most of the advertising dollars go to Facebook and to Google, and they produce zero content. So none of the money that they are making is actually going to make anything. It's all being made by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, whose money is being sucked dry. The other part of advertising, and let me also say this, I have nothing against really good advertising. I also have nothing against advertising when we know it's advertising. The problem becomes when we don't know that it's advertising that we are engaging with. And so that's part of the conversation. Where I start to get concerned as an alternative model is if the only way comes to support these forms of media is to pay for it, then it's only the people in the upper socioeconomic strata that have access to information. And I don't think that's a society we want to be living in either.
I think it was Scott Galloway once said actually that advertising is becoming tax on the poor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that.
So what do you think, guys? What do you think? Do you not just do you agree? Do you have a comment on any of these things? Do you think that we have become better consumers than citizens, and that there's kind of lots of space, as Des is also saying, that we should be aggregating our efforts better?
There's a lot of investments came into producing this desirable audience. I think that's also part of the, I mean, when you surf around the web, you simply feel that there's a better way to do it and the worst way to do it. You feel that certain content is made in a way that you know, with these, for example, a lot of clicks now, you can't read a whole article without clicking at least 3 or 4 times. So there's all the time activating audiences in order for them to stay, kind of to be active, to stay alive and be interested in all these things. And I think it taps into a much broader issue of activation in capitalist societies, like why do we need to be active all the time, productive all the time, leaving traces all the time? One of the things that I've been really inspired by is this idea of media boredom. Like, why is it so bad to be bored while watching a movie or something? Because it also leaves room and time and energy for you to actually do something in your head, not being there in the screen. And I'm, to be honest, more dealing with art, theater, performing arts, and so on. That's also a space which has jumped onto this bandwagon of we are all productive, participatory, moving, jumping, creating things, and so on. And I think that basically creating yourself as this constantly producing self is an obstacle to a critical self, to a reflective self, to a, I don't know, even bored self.
And to pick up on that point, there was one interesting research in the UK from a year or two, probably, that actually stated that about 40% of the UK population is not able to sit in a room without any distraction for more than 15 minutes. So it seems that we kind of got trained to be distracted. Is that kind of the feeling that we share or not? No?
Because
you're in the middle.
Well, this is the thing. I'm thinking from both from an academic point of view, and then and then also from somebody who's from the UK and has a living room, thinking, how long could I go before I need to do something? Actually, I have a phone ban in the living room. I don't have phones or tablets in the living room because I'll end up checking emails. I just don't do it. But I guess we've kind of always had to, the politics of media pessimism, I do take slight umbrage with.
Okay.
I get a lot out of many of these technologies in terms of kind of phones, in terms of questions of digital addiction, in terms of kind of dark patterns and all this kind of thing. These are real issues for sure. But in terms of kind of even think about kind of rejecting the technologies outright, for me that just kind of seems a bit too reactionary.
Okay. And do pick up on that. Do explain why. Why do you think it's too reactionary?
Well, because I think it's interesting from the panel this morning. We talked about kind of things like LinkedIn and this kind of whole thing about kind of counting likes and numbers and metrics, and there is for sure kind of a metric quantity culture, and I get all of that kind of stuff. But on the other side, in terms of kind of use of Twitter during times of kind of protests and demonstrations, we've kind of built alliances and affective alliances with kind of other union branches and organizations who kind of, so we've been able to kind of act in solidarity through mediated networks. So I think the idea that kind of social media is kind of all bad, I just don't buy it. For me, it's just one particular narrative to choose from, but it's not a narrative that I could follow all the way.
Can I advance the social media is all bad narrative to some extent? It strikes me that one source of hope is the fact that most marketing doesn't really work. So you have a self-fulfilling myth of marketers, and that sustains them much as it sustains their relation with consumers. So we've heard some topics today that feed into that myth about marketing being this all-powerful and fiendishly clever system, which persuades us. But, for example, with algorithmic advertising on Facebook, there's a huge grey area. Advertising agencies don't want to really tell their clients that actually most of these clicks and likes and the numbers, they don't know where they come from. They don't know if they're bots. They don't know if they're real or fake accounts. It's there's fraud on a massive scale in digital advertising. But nobody really wants to know. The client doesn't really want to know because they have a beautiful set of numbers to show their accountant, and they can get the budget sustained each year. So they're not interested. The consumers are just bewildered at all these totally irrelevant algorithmic things popping up, and you click it shut and you click it shut. How many times has something popped up and you thought, wow, yeah, I've got to buy that? Not very often. And the whole premise of programmatic advertising is based on a misunderstanding of how advertising works. All the finance director knows, and they probably have more insight than the marketers, is if they drop their ad spend by a couple of % one year, then that time next year, they've dropped their market share by a couple of %. I mean, drop it in relation to what the competitors are spending. It's as simple as that. So what they spend it on doesn't necessarily matter. We've heard a bit about neuromarketing, which is huge. I mean, most of the global consumer goods companies have hired, for 5 or 10 years now, they've hired teams of neuropsychologists. They've bought them an MRI scanner. So in Britain, you know, if you want an MRI scan for something terribly wrong with you, you've got to wait a year or something for that. They're just sitting around these machines thinking of ideas, reasons to stuff consumers in, and then show them an ad or give them a chocolate bar to taste or something, and read which part of their brain lights up. And some organizations now, they don't allow an advert out of the door until it's been done by the neuropsychologists. But this is more scientific reassurance for marketers than it is actually something that can predict anything useful. So you have all this myth of clever marketing, and it's a self-sustaining myth. But what it is doing is maintaining a system of control and surveillance that is eroding people's ability to read information in a critical way. So we heard about distraction a moment ago, and I confess that I'm guilty of that. I find it difficult to sit through TV shows, even engrossing ones, without tweeting and checking stuff and all. And so I'm a victim of it also. But this brings me back to paratexts, of course, because people are enculturated, especially younger people today, into taking in fragmented bits of information rather than engaging with long-form information. And I think that is having a pervasive cultural effect. Think of how many, there's 100 million people in America who read Donald Trump's tweets, and they form all their political views from those. They've never read any political economy. They don't read any long speeches. Donald Trump doesn't make any long speeches longer than 140 characters. And I read recently that Trump-related tweets constitute half of Twitter's growth in income. There is, Professor Fatić earlier mentioned the role of politicians as entertainers, and there's so the system of marketing, including political marketing, is becoming a self-sustaining machine. And at the end of it, I am quite pessimistic about. I mean, obviously there's, you have different groups of people, and in this room we have a lot of critical, reflexive people who like thinking about stuff and reading critically and so forth. But outside these walls in the greater world, there are a lot of people who maybe don't have that sort of access to education, or maybe don't have that sort of freedom to do that, and they like look at the 100 million voters in America. They get some reassurance in closing off their minds to that sort of critical consciousness, and that kind of mentality is continuously reinforced via social media. So I would be quite pessimistic about the effect of social media on citizenship and public consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you don't like the current reality of social media, your own kind of fake news and weaponized information, I guess one of the things that we didn't really get to talk about is kind of the role of deepfakes in terms of kind of what's kind of sitting on the horizon line. So if we don't like what we've got now, then we've got more.
It's only going to get worse.
But we need to talk.
Yeah. I just wanted to add something to this conversation. My PhD is actually in something called media ecology. And I studied with Neil Postman, if any of you know Neil Postman. And so he wrote a book called Entertaining Ourselves to Death and Technopoly and a whole lot of other books. But when we think, when media ecologists think about media, and we talk about it as media ecology, because we think of how does the ecology of a society change when you put different types of technology into it. So, so think about this in terms of, how has the way that you live your life changed because of this thing? And you notice I don't have mine up here with me. And that's a conscious decision on my part not to do it. And if you read the work of people like Sherry Turkle, who has said that if you have this technology on the table with you when you go out to dinner with your friends, as soon as there's a lull in the conversation, as soon as there's this possibility of boredom entering into the space, you grab for the phone. And so this starts to have an impact on our relationships to people, right? And this is what was talked about on the panel, is that ability to have that close connection with people starts to be reframed because of this technology being part of the system. Another conversation I was having with somebody out in the hallway as well is this idea of performativity within these social media spaces. So that if we're on Facebook, it's not really us. It's an idea of, and I think other people have talked about this too, but I've been playing around with this idea of the digital doppelganger, right? That it's not really us, it's this other thing that is sort of like us, but not really us. And so the difference and the way that research has been done in the past, like if I looked at a woman's magazine, I would tend to feel worse about myself for having looked at a women's magazine because I would be comparing myself to the models in the magazine. But it's very different when I do that in the Facebook or social media space because I'm not comparing myself to someone I don't know. I'm comparing myself to people I do know. And so that's within the realm of possibility of something I should be able to do. But what people are putting into that space is the vacation they went with on their husband and not the fight they had with their husband in the morning. Yeah. And so how do you begin to live up to that heightened sense of reality?
This is saying in London that nobody's as happy as on Facebook, as successful as on LinkedIn, as pretty as on Instagram, and as mad as on Twitter.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. So, and questions? Yes, please.
It's not really a question, sorry, but it's more of I like this media ecology thing, and I don't think it would be actually a problem at all if it would be digital media just one out of so many ways of communicating. It's always about hegemony that we are stuck in the problem. It is when we conform to a certain hierarchy of values of attractability, desirability, whatever, because now when you're not there, it's like you're dead when you're not there and so on. That's the thing I think is the most problematic, this hegemony that we all feel like if you're not there, there's something wrong with you, or you have to be a radically rebellious person not to have a Facebook account. Come on, I mean, how did we come there?
Yeah.
It's a huge pressure. Any questions from the floor? Yes, please.
It's more of a comment. Listening to you all talking about this, I'm thinking of hyper everything. Social media is hyper everything. I think we people, marketers, scientists, we take the easy way out because we send messages to the customers that making them extremely angry or extremely happy. So people can't be extremely angry and extremely happy all the time because it's not biologically possible because our emotions are put in some tanks and we can be extremely, extremely angry just a small amount of time and extremely angry, happy, small amount of time. And the tank is leaking. So most of the time, people are like baseline. They don't have strong emotions. And we made them with, people are made themselves and we made them to be extreme all the time.
And we say we, do you mean media or the...
Both. Okay. Media, algorithms, platforms and everything. And we made people to put themselves in two tribes, once for and once against. And I believe that people are leaving platforms, Facebook and Twitter and stuff, when something extremely is against their values. Because people are not leaving Facebook because they don't like some pictures that they've seen. People leave Facebook because of the leak of data. That's fundamentally wrong, because we saw the data from the UK, 50% of people don't want to be followed. And they believe that Facebook followed them, but restored their data safely, and it leaked. So that's against their values. I believe that people are doing things when we find out in some moment that fundamentally is wrong in algorithms, an easy way out, people are going to drop it. But communication states, building relationships, that's everything. You know, it's not about putting people in extreme situation, but continuous talking and continuous communication, the way that you develop customers to buy your products, to believe in some values, to engage politically, not just butt tweet, I'm sorry, of Donald Trump with whatever it is.
but there's many things kind of in your observation. Some of those kind of been answered already, and some of those may have been. But I will go back to Andy again, because you're absolutely right. There is kind of a huge wave. Very often it was informed, there's data behind it, but I do admit that actually sometimes it's just kind of the sense of frustration, probably with what's going on, of the negative effects of the whole kind of new media sphere and the algorithmical media sphere. And you're kind of pushing a little bit kind of against and say, okay, maybe it's not completely black and white, maybe there's shades of gray in between. But do you, honestly, do you think that kind of things still fall slightly more on the black side or not? Even with the shades of gray, that we're actually in real danger, that's what I'm trying to say.
So
You've got to cheer us all up now, Andrew.
Oh, yeah. Honestly, I'm probably slightly more optimistic.
Okay.
We should end
That's
there.
agency people applauding.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm joking.
Yeah. In Europe, we take some of the strongest measures, I'm thinking at a European level, to kind of counter questions of algorithmic opacity, bias, all of these kind of key questions which, if they're not already with us, are coming down the line. I don't think there's silver bullet solutions. There's certainly more work to be done, but I think, when you kind of look, you asked me kind of a very general question about is technology a good or a bad thing. In terms of looking across the kind of the overall spectrum, it delivers some good stuff.
Okay, should we allow some kind of punches from the left?
No, I find it weird after such a fantastic day. We're asking this particular question. Is technology good or bad for human life or democracy? It reminds me, I was once, forgive me for telling this story, but approached by a very big, it's a BBC show that runs on Sunday mornings called the Big Issue or Big Issue, the Big Question. And they take one question, and it's actually a really good program to watch, but it's structured very interestingly, which there's two sides of the room. So it's a small studio, and you either sit on one side or the other. So the researcher rang me up and said, we'd like you to come on. We've read your work, we want you to come on, and it's about, is technology good for democracy or not? What do you think? So I said, well, I can't really answer that question because it's neither good nor bad. It is both. Like everything else in the world, it is not black or white. It is black and white. It is shades of all colours. It depends not on the technology, but on the circumstances in which people find themselves, the balance of power. So I could hit the research was going, yeah, it's kind of interesting. That's all very interesting. But could I just say, do you think that technology is good or bad for democracy? I didn't get invited onto the program after that because they didn't know where I was going to sit. Now, I think that is the approach. It is fundamentally contradictory. It is both things. Of course, at the moment, we are finding very scary ways in which technology is being used for anti-democratic purposes in a scale, when you think of Facebook's reach, that no other single institution, I don't think even any religion has had that scale. We are right to ask questions about it. We are also right to expect that it could be changed if there was significant political pressure. But at the same time, how can you talk to, Andrew's involved in some, I'm not outing you in any way, but there are some difficulties at his institution where some of the activists are using social media. So are they wrong to do it? Of course not. They are doing both. What's wrong is when we talk about human destiny being guided by technology alone, as if, again, we go back to the Arab Spring. Arab Spring was a creature of Facebook. Of course it wasn't. But the idea that we should be forced to choose sides, I think, is the wrong starting point. The question is, what do we do? And in that sense, it's a very difficult question, because I think we have to do lots of different things at the same time. We should be asking for and pressurizing for fundamental changes to how these technologies are regulated. There is a very big environmental problem. As much as I think we should not give up technologies, there is a big environmental problem with the fact that, cloud, you will know more than I about this, that the servers themselves are sucking up enormous amounts of electricity, which is disastrous for the planet. That is something we need to act on, and I am so pleased to see people across the world acting on it. At the same time, as Siva says, you quoted Siva Vaidyanathan's book on anti-social media. He has a very famous phrase, which he says, the problem with Facebook is Facebook. You can't just tinker around with it. Right. Its logic, its operating logic, is predicated on, he puts it, theft. Yeah. And if you change it, then actually it stops becoming Facebook. So at the same time, I think we should try and change it, but that may mean that it is no longer Facebook. Well, good. But please, the idea that we should be forced to sit on one side of the room, or some people cheer or not, although I kind of like it, it's the end of the day excitement. I'm not sure is where we should be.
But can we rephrase? Sorry, Mara, can you just rephrase to pick up on that one? Coming back to
sure.
Do you see? This is my question. Do you see more reasons for you to be activists? Or active in the way that you've been doing it in the last 10 or 15 years or not?
You don't want to hear from me, Mark, you go. There is never a reason not to be active.
Yeah, but do you see more reasons these days?
Yeah.
No, I see different reasons, but based on the same fundamental problems of, the commodification of everyday life. The datafication is just a contemporary expression of people's labours being stolen and given to other processes. Now it's happening in a very insidious and, in many ways, an anti-democratic way. But that's not new.
So old problems in you guys?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Mara, please.
Dana Boyd has a book called It's Complicated, if you don't know the book. And I don't always agree with Dana Boyd, but in this one sense I do. She runs Data and Society, which somebody quoted one of the studies that they've done. But she talks about in this book for young kids how they interact with each other in the online space instead of seeing each other in person. And she argues that part of the reason for that is that we've created this idea that the real life space is no longer safe, right? That there's, in the United States, they have Amber Alerts, right? There's things that every time somebody's, picked up, that suddenly everybody gets an alert on their phone that a child's been snatched. Now, there's not more children being snatched. It's just that they have this Amber Alert that lets us know. So is it really any different from my daughter being on Snapchat for 3 hours talking to her friends than it was for me as a teenager talking on the phone with my friends for 3 hours a day? I don't know that it's that much different. I think it's her preferred use of interacting with her friends. And so I think, in terms of this idea of good, bad, I think this binary is not really useful in talking about this technology because it depends on what we're talking about the use of the technology for.
My former PhD student and I did some work with children and video games specifically, but more generally digital technology. And the major finding was that it was tremendously enabling to their lives, and they used the technology. And these, bear in mind, they were kids from sort of relatively caring sort of homes, reasonably wealthy homes, whose activity was monitored and so forth. And they had a range of other activities they could do. But they used the technology to interact, to supplement their interaction. So they would talk about it in the daytime with their friends. And in fact, it was a prerequisite because they needed, in order to be in the peer group, they needed to be au fait with the latest games and the latest technology, because otherwise they'd have nothing to talk about, and they wouldn't be the cool kid in the group. So there was a long time ago, there was a study in advertising that showed the same thing, that kids at school talk about advertising, and that's one of the ways in which they connect with groups and sort of negotiate their social hierarchy. But the research, she's Dr. Dina Bassiouni out of American University in Cairo. So we published this, and it was very, very enabling. We had to say it was very positive for the kids, and they used it in a very rational way. They didn't displace activities of playing sports and doing active things or interaction. It was a supplement. So it's hard to deny that this technology and social media make childhood way more fun than mine was. I don't know about you guys, but mine was so boring. It was just shocking. And but don't start me. But today, there are very positive elements of it. I guess the question becomes whether they can balance that influence with all the other range of other influences in their lives as they grow up, and maybe some of us aren't so good at that.
It's for all of you, but maybe for Mr. McStay, mostly because he talked about this empathic technology. And some kind of point or question would be, it sounds nice, empathic technology, but my problem that I have with that is that it relies on some hypothesis that emotions are good and that emotions are those that lead us in our everyday life. And maybe the best example would be when we have, for example, Notre Dame, the burning of Notre Dame. It can, it can produce emotions like anger, like sadness, but it also can produce the emotion of excitement and maybe to say happiness in someone that something is burning because it's not ours, or etc. And this also neuromarketing and this empathic technology on one way neglects my own will and my principles that could be ethical and not emotional, that I don't want to feel this way. So my question would be, are there any, let's say, trying to adapt this empathic technology and neuromarketing to account not only emotions, but also some ethical principles who always take us a step back? Because sometimes I feel that way, but I don't want to feel that way. I want to feel a different way, and I have a right on my own will to try to reshape my feelings or control them. And this way of marketing and advertising maybe produces emotions like a primary pillar of my identity and of my interacting in society.
Yeah, okay. So I guess, in a sense, is what you're asking is there a chance to reconsider? Is there a chance to negotiate with the technologies that you're using? And I think this issue of choice is incredibly important. And this goes for any technology that uses personal or intimate data. We should be able to challenge, we should be able to augment, and we should be able to interact with data that is used about us. And I think particularly when it's kind of something like to do with data about emotions, that information should not be taken if we don't want to be taken from us, whether it be identifying or not identifying. So I think in the case, you kind of mentioned the kind of Notre Dame thing. But I think you could talk about it in a retail context, for example. So if you have Amazon Go, for example, which running their recognition software in an Amazon Go store, maybe there's a product that you're not really meant to like. Maybe you're vegan, but you see a burger and it looks really nice, whatever it might be. Then you should be able to negotiate with that data. You should be able to pull that data. You should be able to have access to it in some way, shape, or it should not be taken from you in a way that you don't have control over. And I think as these technologies, we'll see kind of as we kind of creep into the early 2020s, emotion sensing technologies will become the norm in different spaces and in different devices. And it's really important that we have access and control over that.
I would also add the idea of emotional contagion. People know the idea of emotional contagion. This is probably people most know about it several years ago, about 3 years ago. What Facebook did is they took several 100,000 people and put particularly negative content onto their feeds and found that people put up more negative content if they saw more negative content. So it was a way for them to manipulate how people feel. And advertisers use that. I mean, that's what I was talking about in terms of burgers' world. work. And so, you know, I think in terms of, you know, if you want to be able to control your content, and this goes back to the whole idea of agency, know that when you choose to go on those platforms, that they are designed in order to be able to push you to an extreme of an emotion, whether it be positive or negative, and then, it, you know, unfortunately becomes incumbent upon the user to be aware of that and take that into consideration when you start to interact within those spaces.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that we haven't really kind of spoken about, and perhaps this isn't the time to introduce it right towards the end of the day, but we sometimes talk about our technologies as if kind of technology and humanity are kind of two separate things. But of course, people build technologies, and technologies do contribute to humanity. So, you know, they're not separate things. So in terms of kind of where the answers lie, it's about having positive human values in technologies. And I think that's, and so I think as we keep on thinking that they're separate things, then we're going to have problems. Yeah. As soon as we start understanding that technologies are human and social constructs, we get to a better place.
Yeah, I agree with that. So we have 5 books and only 2 questions. Now the third. Yes, please.
Okay, hi. I just wanted to hear your thoughts about disconnecting. Is it possible? And if it is, to what extent? And what are your just professional, personal opinions about disconnecting, or luxurious hotels that offer detoxes for millennials and furthermore? So.
You were saying something about it.
Well, I mean, the book that I mentioned at the end, actually, about breaking up with your phone, it's not about getting rid of your phone, it's about breaking up with your phone. So it's about putting parameters or boundaries around your relationship with your phone. You know, there's different things that different people do based on what their needs are. I mean, the first thing I tell everybody is get rid of the notifications on your phone, period. Just like get rid of them. The second thing is if and when you're ready to do that, get rid of the apps on your phone. Certainly the social media apps. I can't get rid of Uber. I'm sorry, I need my Uber. But, you know, get rid of the social media. If you're going to interact with social media, do it on your computer screen instead. Is that a no?
No.
Oh, I thought you were saying. I thought you were saying.
No, I'm thinking what people will be thinking now. Like, yeah.
You know, and interestingly enough, I have a lot of really religious students who celebrate Shabbat, and so they have one day a week where they are away from their phones. It's not a bad idea to take a day a week or a day a month to be away from your phone. It acts sort of as a reset for you to realize how much do you need it or not need it in your life. And you may find that there are certain things you're not willing to give up, and that's fine. There's no judgment on that. But you may also find that there's a lot of things that you are doing that's wasting your time. And people use the term addiction a lot about it, and I don't know if it's, I'm not sure I'm willing to go as far as to say it's an addiction, but if you do find that you're spending inordinate amounts of time with technology to the detriment of other parts of your life, then you call it an addiction. If you're wasting too much time, I wouldn't call it an addiction, but I would call it an unbelievable time suck. And I know that more people are doing things like taking Facebook vacations. And certainly if you're a scholar and you have to write and you're working on a book or a dissertation, the first thing you need to do is get off Twitter.
I don't want to be cynical about this, but surely these are first world problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, a Facebook vacation, most people in the world don't get holidays. So, I'm not disagreeing with anything that people have said, and I think there are some serious problems. But for me, the crucial thing is about whether this is an individual or a collective issue. So you can do what you want. But if you want to address some of the problems that you see attached to algorithmic bias, to technological addiction, if that's what you want to see it, to anti-democratic structures within Facebook, for example, then you can do what you want with Facebook, really. You can go off onto a nicer network. I mean, it strikes me as a bit counterproductive because Facebook's numbers are still going up, so we're not doing something right. But that's not the issue. The issue is, what is the social and collective response? And I'm not saying it's easy, but that will be the solution to these issues. So I love the idea of a spa, but whether I go to a spa with my phone or not, I mean, saunas are great places because they are technology-free, well, at least in terms of, so I'm all in favor of them, but I do think we have to keep bringing it back to what can people do collectively to address a social problem.
Yeah, nobody should be facing the system alone.
Yeah. No, I think the conversation, and I agree, absolutely agree, obviously. Some of the problem, though, with young people now that are trying to find jobs in this area is that they're being expected to come with a significant presence in the online space. And so how do you balance this? I'm supposed to come with 10,000 followers or 25,000 followers when I want to go get a job at an advertising agency. And I don't know, that's a hard one to do. I mean, I don't know, build up your followers and then go away afterwards. Or buy them.
Very, very cheap, actually, as well. And the Dutch, I think, provided the answer to what you mentioned about playing with the phone in a restaurant. They've got a brilliant device. When you come into a restaurant, all of us have to kind of put the phone on the table. The first one who touches the phone pays the drinks for everybody else. So that's kind of a great way to gamify it. 2 more questions. Oh, no, more! Wow, you're woken up now. Okay, yes, please. Let's go from this. Take the round. Yeah.
My name is Maya. I'm coming from the College of Fine and Applied Arts here in Belgrade, and I have a question about the use of political marketing. About in which ways has intrusive marketing been used in terms of Brexit ever since 2015?
Okay, so we'll take the round of all the questions, actually jot them down, and then kind of answer them collectively. So if you don't mind, kind of just jotting them down, whatever is interesting to you. Okay, so just pass the microphone on. We're going to ask all the questions, and then we'll answer. So Brexit.
So I wanted to ask about the children. Today we have people that have been exposed to mobile phones and the internet for like 20, 25 years at most. And I know I had my first smartphone when I was, I think, 15 years old. But now children have their smartphones from the age of 4 or age of 5, which is very, very early. And I think it has drastic effects on them. And I think that the children today lack social intelligence very much, and I think that that is very alarming. And I'm not sure if that's subjective, if that's only my opinion, but I think that young people today are very anxious. I mean, I think that's a global thing. That, for example, people are living so much in the digital world that most of them are uncomfortable calling and ordering for a pizza. I mean, people don't communicate in person that much anymore. So I wanted to ask, is there any data about it? I mean, is that just my opinion, or are there some information that it's affecting children, the way they live today? Okay,
thank you very much for that. Yes, please, just behind you.
Hi, this might be a little ungrateful to ask because this is a prediction for the future. But as a technological student, I see that new technologies are emerging like AR, VR, that are really going to be commercial really soon. And I see that advertising will go in that way, like we will wear glasses and a pop-up commercial will come. So do you think that we as young people, young advertisers, should think about creating new ethics for those technologies, maybe trying to avoid them? What do you think could happen?
Thank you very much. What was the next one? Yeah.
I wanted to ask Mr. Friedman and Ms. Einstein. You told something about it's not worse, it's just different. It's black and white.
Challenges.
And all kinds of colors. And also you, Mara, you mentioned there's same social behavior, like you talking to your friend for 2 hours on the phone and your daughter doing the same thing but on a different tool. So yeah, the conclusion is the tool has changed and improved, but the thing is it's going to improve even more. So do you think that the improvement is the cause of the fear of losing control and growing a distance in organic relationships? If you understood me, sorry, I'm nervous.
It's okay, don't be nervous.
Don't be, yeah.
So this is more of a comment that I was interested in. So I feel like lately on social media, people are very critical of the content that they see, and they take an active role in what they engage with. I'm thinking of pages like Diet Prada, for example, which completely canceled a show by Dolce & Gabbana in Shanghai because of their racist ads. And this was all started off with a story on Instagram. And I was wondering if consumers are taking over brands, and can consumers effectively destroy a brand through digital means? And kind of, I was interested in your opinion.
Thank you. Do we have one or two more? Yeah. Got one here as well, and then one over there.
This will be one quick question. What are your thoughts on AI in the future and its implications of danger, pretty much, in terms of sociological, I can't pronounce it. But I mean, do you have a positive perspective or a negative one in terms of how fast it's advancing? That's it.
So what was the question? Sorry, I missed that one. What was the question?
It was the positives and negatives of AI in the future.
Is it my turn now? Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today, really, for giving us your time. I just wanted to ask you, well, basically, it's also about Brexit, AI, and everything, and it's about kids as well. It's everything. Yeah, thank you. So basically, it's about people studying something today that maybe not be, exist as a profession in the future. What do you think about that? Like, how quickly should we learn new things? Obviously, we're all upgrading ourselves outside of the universities and things, but all the professions may be taking away from us. And what are your thoughts about that? How do you feel about that? Thank you.
Thank you.
And also, internet is an amazing thing. We just don't know how to use it. So thank you.
Can I get a comment and 2 questions?
All right, shoot,
I'll be
but
fast.
quickly.
Okay, I work in native programmatic industry, so I think it's very important to distinguish 2 things. There is Facebook ads, there is social media, there is life beyond the social media, and that is target audience on social media. On the other side, the DSP I work for example, is actually a conglomerate of 40+ native exchanges. What we do is that we're not targeting social media at all. So in the era in which people are not actually knowing how to define native advertising and programmatic advertising, I think that there's a big mistake of offering the solution which is basically focused only on social media. Because 70% of advertising is actually happening via premium publishers, news media, news portals, even YouTube or video advertising that is only strictly native programmatic. So I would love to hear an extra day of this conference and hear your opinions about basically having the distinctive forms of social media native advertising and premium publishers/publishers native advertising. 2 questions. Mr. Friedman, when you're talking about AI, the case from last year, the Amazon recruiting tool that started discriminating women when started to hire them, was based on a pattern of data that was basically uploaded to the recruiting HRIA tool. The thing that happened was basically, in a nutshell, that it started hiring only men representatives, or basically people who define themselves as males, due to the fact that for the data that was uploaded for the last 40 years, the discriminative pattern of women not being employable was something that the AI learned as the most important thing. What is your stance on the following AIs? I think somebody also asked about AIs. What is the stance? What can we expect as the next big thing? Because AI development is teaching us that, be it a sexual robot or just the human debater or versus the robot debater next to the Amazon recruiting tool, we're not seeing good practices of the AI tools actually knowing what they're doing. So I'm wondering, how are you standing in that verge of basically pros and cons on the AI, but based on the practices we had in the last couple of years? And second question is for Mr. Hackley regarding the Paratext contacts. Godiva chocolates in Asia, specifically Japan, 2 years ago were launching a negative advertising campaign, which was in the context of the days of the lost, 14th of February, basically, the month of the love, I don't know, Valentine's Day, Jesus, Valentine's Day. the Japan structure and tradition is having the thing where female representatives are forced into buying chocolates for their men, husbands, boyfriends, colleagues, yada, yada, yada. Godiva, as like one of the biggest chocolate producers in the world, launched a campaign which is forcing women and telling women not to buy chocolates, which basically changed the entire narratives of Japanese traditional society in 21st century. What is your stand of negative advertising, and how is Paratext actually following into the political context, and how can we see the development of negative advertising changing in the future? Mrs. Einstein, I would like to hear you as well on this one specifically. And thank you, it was absolutely lovely to spend the working day with all of you.
Thank you. Way. And okay, all fine, all asked. Brilliant. So we're going to take a deep breath and then shoot.
Yes, no, no, yes,
Whoever,
yes, no.
whoever wants to do first, to answer first. So let's start ticking.
Do you want, I wrote a bunch of stuff down. I'll see if I can respond to all of these as quickly as possible. In terms of children, there's a book called iGeneration by, I think it's Jennifer Twenge, Twenge, and she talks about the impact of digital technologies on the new generation, in particular as it relates to, she's a psychologist, in particular as it relates to depression, anxiety, and so on, and I think it ties into some of the other things that we've been talking about. In terms of AR and VR, I can't stand VR because I'm one of those people who gets sick whenever they use VR technology, so I can't talk about it very much. But in terms of augmented reality, we were talking about this at dinner last night, there's a restaurant in New York called Bear Burger where they're using menus, AR menus on the tables, and then translating what you order through those menus to your credit card bill. So they know what you ordered, how you ordered, how much time it took you to order, could they upsell you on buying fries with your burger and all of those sort of things. So those are some of the new ways that AR is being used within a retail environment. So if you can think of how it's going to happen, somebody else has probably already thought about it, how it's going to happen, and it's coming down the pike. In terms of improvement of technology and how, I don't think of it as improvement, I think of it as different, right? And so, and is there a different with my daughter using Snapchat? Yes, somebody's gobbling up data about her at the same time that she's using it. But in terms of the communication or in her relationship to her friends, she's interacting with a whole group of friends at the same time I was interacting with one, and who am I to say that that's any better or worse, right? And she has a lot of friends, and they're real friends, and she has real life relationships with them as well as the relationships that she has with them online. So I don't poo-poo the technology overall as it relates to that. I forget who asked the question. Can't brands be destroyed in the digital space? This was something that people talked about an awful lot when the brands didn't understand how to respond, particularly on Twitter, but brands have gotten very good. If any of you fly Delta, and I don't know if any of you do, but Delta is on it like this. As soon as you post something to Delta, there is somebody responding, turns it around, will get you what you need. Disney is also very good. Tell them they're not magical and they've ruined your vacation, and they will be on it in a heartbeat.
Did they make it magical then?
They did. They gave me free passes. It was really excellent. So they will do anything to turn around what you're thinking about that brand is. Can a brand be damaged? Yes, I think it can be damaged. But I think that most brands have been very good at being able to know how to flip it and turn it around fairly quickly. In terms of updating skills, which was over here somewhere, I'm actually writing a book about higher education right now, and while it's important to update your skills, what I know, at least in the United States, is what most employers want is your critical skills. They want your critical thinking skills. And that's something that they can't teach you and can't train you how to do. And that's something, there's a difference between learning and educating. And what you're getting at a university is an education. You're not learning individual skills. And so what you will learn in a university context is something that's very different. In the corner about programmatic ad buying, I have half a chapter about programmatic ad buying and black ops advertising. Within the context of this talk, I couldn't talk about it beyond native, but I'm happy to chat with you about it anytime. And negative advertising, I'm going to let somebody else talk.
Can I
very much. Thank you.
Can I better speak because I'm going to forget the few questions that I can remember if I don't speak soon. As regards the example from the Japanese, you described it as negative advertising, but I understand negative advertising as what the Americans call knocking copy, when one ad criticizes another brand. The example you gave sounds more like cultural disruption. Which is very, very effective in many ways. Douglas Holt writes in his cultural branding work about brands being sensitive to ideological contradictions and creating some sort of cultural disruption and mobilizing that through cultural activism. So it sounds as if that's what the chocolate brand did there. And another example more recently you might think of as Nike, when they used the American football player, whose name I forget now. Kaepernick. And initially, they got shocking social media. People were burning their Nike shoes on social media. Then Nike produced a little guide as to how to burn your Nike stuff safely without injuring yourself. And of course, within a couple of months, it transpired that their sales had increased. And so all these people saying they were going to boycott Nike were just full of wind. But what Nike did, which they're very good at, was they recognized that this was an element of cultural disruption and cultural activism that would play with the agenda of most of their consumers. And so they judged it very finely. So I think where brands judge that correctly, then that can be extremely positive. Negative advertising isn't quite the way I'd describe it. I'd describe it more as cultural activism. As regards to one of the other questions,
Brexit.
Yeah, Brexit, extremely active. It's only slowly emerging where large chunks of money came and were spent on Facebook. I follow a couple of local websites where basically local people gossip with each other. It was very evident to me that there were lots of fake accounts and they peaked around the referendum. And from reading from the comments, people, including the moderators, couldn't figure that these were fake accounts or weren't interested enough to look at them and figure that they were. And there was extensive propagandizing that really leveraged the negative emotions about the EU and perpetrated a whole list of about 10 myths about the EU, which can be very quickly debunked, but amongst Brexit proponents, they don't really want to hear the debunking. And so things like the EU, people being unelected, and about EU rules countermanding UK laws and stuff like that, which isn't true, and about the cost to the UK of being in the EU, which is also a complete fiction, and yet they assumes the force of undeniable truth because of the reinforcement they received on Facebook. So it was extremely extensive, and I think it'll take time before we understand the true extent of how it was, of how much there was of it. Last one that I can remember is about children and the internet, of course. My youngest kid is 5, and she said to me the other day, "Can I have a mobile phone, Dad?" And I said, "Yeah, you can have one when you're 28." And she said, "Okay." And I'll have. I think there are battles ahead about that, but it terrifies me. The stories we've had recently on in the UK news about young kids, young teenagers really, being involved in social media and getting very, very negative emotions and so forth, killing themselves and all sorts of that sort of thing is terrifying. And my oldest kid, who's 27, uses it very well. He's on LinkedIn. He's looking for jobs. He's qualified, and it's a very important networking device. He keeps in touch with a huge circle of friends. Occasionally including me, and it's a very, very enabling technology for him, I think. So it's difficult to strike a balance, and I think it's important to educate kids probably in social media to some extent, and in the way that they can use it, but in in a very circumspect way, I think. And those are all the questions I can actually remember.
Thank you very much, Chris. And Andrew, there were kind of a few questions specifically in your area regarding ethics and AI and empathic technology as well.
Yeah, I mean, to pick up on the question of kind of things that we should be looking at today, I think, rather than trying to catch the breaking wave, it's about kind of finding what is it that actually drives the wave itself. And that requires a slightly slower, more studied and substantive look at what causes kind of cultural, social, and technological change. So I think we're in a university setting here. I think, take the time. Understand what the deep drivers are rather than just trying to capture every kind of recent thing. And I think, when it kind of comes to questions of AI in the future and all that kind of stuff, we could read off kind of a whole list of things, kind of utopian and dystopian. But really, I think it's about understanding, obtaining a sense of what the technologies actually are, what they actually do, rather than trying to capture a sense of kind of what the future iterations of these things may be. So again, overall, I think it's kind of slower and more substantive. In terms of the AR, VR question, in terms of that one, I'm skeptical that people are going to be wearing kind of augmented reality glasses. Google Glass didn't work out that well. There are a few more kind of versions kind of coming onto the market that the form function is a little bit better, but Snapchat tried their own glasses. It wasn't an AR thing. My students don't even know what those glasses were. They didn't even hear about it. So I'm, in terms of whether kind of AR is going to be a really kind of big thing in advertising, it's been gimmicky since, kind of late 1990s. AR has been around for a while now. In terms of AR glasses, I'm kind of slightly skeptical on that one. Polcoms and Brexit, I'm not the specialist on this, but I think it's really interesting to kind of see what lessons can be taken from there and from the US elections and elsewhere, Philippines as well. I also have in mind, particularly around kind of how things such as sentiment analysis are applied. So, in terms of kind of the emotional AI side of things, sentiment analysis and emotional segmentation is going to be remains a concern and an issue.
Thank you very much. And just one tiny bit. You've developed some ethical guidelines specifically for the AI space. Do you mind just taking us through a few points? Sorry.
Yeah, I wish I had my laptop open with me. I worked with Change Sciences. They do advise kind of a bunch of some of the big US companies. And in essence, what we were trying to do was trying to design an ethical set of standards by which emotional AI should function. First, of course, it should be legal. Second, that, in terms of when we're thinking about kind of ethics and technology, you have hard ethics and you have soft ethics. Soft ethics is the more cultural stuff. Hard ethics is kind of the legal and policy stuff. And we should not allow soft ethics to get in the way of hard ethics. In terms of soft ethics itself, I think it's about, there's around kind of 10, 12 codes, which I can't remember off the top of my head. But in essence, they kind of fall into kind of questions of kind of making sure the training data is appropriate and right. That's kind of something that it sounds like a technicality, but it underpins so many questions about AI in terms of the reliability and the validity. And certainly the emotional AI companies that I talked to in doing the study, they question their own data, they question their own training data. And given that in advertising, it doesn't matter so much, but when it kind of comes to things such as insurance, kind of life options, policing and so forth, it matters.
Human validation?
In what way?
Or supervision, sorry, not validation, supervision.
So in terms of kind of supervision of the data, for sure,
Okay, thank you very much. Des?
Thank you for fantastic questions. I can't believe you're still all awake and listening and contributing. So I can't possibly answer all of them. I want to say that we live in a world which is scarred by environmental degradation, by inequality, by sexism, by racism, by fear of people who look different to us. And yet, somehow we're surprised when those divisions mark our technologies. I mean, how would we expect technologies not to reflect the world from which they emerge? So there is a correlation between them, and this presents us both with opportunities, but also with problems. And so when it comes, I refuse ever to speculate about the future because I will always be wrong. That's my cop-out in answer to you. But what I would say is we should be very suspicious of those stories that are told by particular powerful people about future technologies because they have an investment in them, not just financial investment. You know, they are a lifelong investment to tell particular stories. And these are stories sometimes we are desperate to hear. So back in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, there was a real desire for more internationalism. There was something called the telectroscope, which was a giant telescope that you allowed people to see over vast distances. Does anyone remember the telectroscope? I really hope no one puts their hands up. It'd be very embarrassing. No, it's because it didn't exist. It was a fictional technology recreated by artists in New York, I think it was, a couple of years ago. But it made sense. It kind of reflected the human desire to do things in a particular way. But of course, you couldn't have a telescope looking over an ocean. And I think there are stories which are told about emerging technologies. What we want to do is to shape those stories, to be the ones to make sure that priorities that are dear to us, that aren't about environmental destruction, that are about equality, you know, when it comes to kids, one of the, you know, the world is marked by anxiety for many, many different reasons. The idea that anxiety has been generated or produced by particular tools, I think is wrong. We don't know yet how anxiety has been, you know, intensified or not by, you know, particular forms of digital addiction or not. But I mean, anxiety reflects the world in which, you know, most kids in the world don't have enough to eat. So that sounds like a smug answer, as if we shouldn't then look at the technologies. I'm not saying that. We should understand them in relation to other social forces. And as with anything else, you know, the future really is, you know, sometimes it's presented to us as preordained, but we know that isn't true. And so the same with any kind of technological predictions, we have to do everything we can to shape the future. We do this in so many different ways. Why would we not want to do it with these technologies, which are in and of themselves the result of all sorts of battles? And we just have to insert ourselves into these battles. Sometimes it feels like we're losing. That will not always be the case, and things can change quite rapidly. And the fact that you are all in this room asking these fantastic questions makes me, if I had to choose which side of the room to sit on, I would be an optimist.
Thank you so much.